With that, let me introduce you to your host today. We have W. Curtis Preston, who's the founder of Truth in IT, also known as Mr. Backup, and our founder and CEO of Infoscale, Ken Shaw. Take it away, guys.
Good morning, everybody, and good morning to Ken. And I guess we'll get started here. I like this idea. We came up with this idea of moving the backup out of the forest and into the cloud. I thought that was kind of a catchy little phrase there. So we're going to talk about three trends that have happened, I would say, over the last few years, and they're continuing to happen now. The first one we'll talk about is increased data fragmentation, and then we'll also talk about evaporating cloud barriers. And then finally, we'll talk about something called a hybrid appliance, which is a pretty, a pretty common architecture at this point. And then Ken will finish up with talking a little bit about Infoscale.
And I'll just encourage everybody, Curtis, to use the questions tool. We're actually going to be giving away a Kindle to a random person who asks a question. So if they ask more questions, they've got more shots at that Kindle. So I'll just add that before we dive right in.
All right, so let's just talk about increased data fragmentation. Go ahead, go to the next slide, Ken. So, it's interesting. Just before this call, I've got a new employee, and I've been giving them, if you can imagine, giving someone the history of computing. 20 years, I've been in this industry for 21 years, and giving someone the history of computing in less than an hour. But that box over to the left is what I came to, right? It wasn't that long ago that basically everything was in the data center, right? You came to work. If you wanted to do something, you brought you either had a desktop at work or you brought your laptop to work, and you used the data center. Maybe you might have had remote access to connect to the data center, but that was considered fancy, right? But now there almost is no data center, right? First off, we've moved so much more compute out into the mobile arena, right? We have more power in my iPhone than I think my data center had when I was, when I started this 21 years ago, right? In fact, that they say that we have more power in our pocket than they had to launch the rockets to the moon. And you look at what we have is the data is just all over the place. We do still have data, on-prem. We might have a private cloud. We might have our ERP system on board. We also might have a significant amount of compute and processing and creation of data actually out on those mobile systems, right? We do a lot of crunching out there on the mobile systems, and then of course we have things like Salesforce out there in the public cloud, and so the data for a given company is now absolutely all over the place. So it's just I like that term, data fragmentation.
Yeah, when I talk about data fragmentation, I break it into three buckets, right, of like super trends that are driving it. One's mobile, which you just talked to well. Second is virtualization, right? VM sprawl on hypervisors internally, so an absolute nightmare when it comes to data protection. And then you mentioned also cloud, whether that be developers spinning up VMs out in AWS or people deploying things on, say, an OpenStack infrastructure in-house. It's become so much harder to keep track of all of the different bits and bytes that are being created across the enterprise, and the complexity has gotten out of control. And so what when you and I, Curtis, were talking the other day about potential solutions for this, simplicity to me is really key, because that complexity creates coverage gaps, and the coverage gaps create risk. And so I've just advanced it to the new slide. Do you want to talk to this?
Yeah, sure. There are, one of the things I often say is that in IT, we never fix anything, we just move it. And
Yep.
yeah, and so we had all sorts of problems with physical servers. We had all sorts of problems with SCSI, the way it was originally designed, right, or originally used, which was direct attached disks and a direct attached tape drives. We had problems with that, so we came up with storage networking, which solved one problem but created a whole bunch of others. We had a problem with physical servers, and one of the problems was recovery, right? One of the problems was having to do what we call bare metal recovery. It was a real problem if a server melted, right? And so one of the problems that we solved by going to virtual servers is a recovery problem. But oddly enough, we created a backup problem, right? The whole problem of physics, right? Where you put 20 servers inside one server, and then you wonder why the I/O sucks, right? And then of course, the even more and more data is going to be moving from physical servers to virtual servers, and more stuff is going to be happening out on the endpoints, and even as far as the endpoints that are smartphones and tablets, right? More and more people are wandering around with just a tablet and or a smartphone, or some people have a phablet, right? Which is those ridiculously large phones that might as well be a tablet. And then the data is that was the target side there. The data is almost it's becoming increasingly rare that data is being backed up to a something that's on premise, right? It's being done to some sort of cloud device.
Yeah, and what we see a lot then is that backup administrators or IT companies have to adopt multiple tools. So they've got one system that they're using to back up and protect physical servers. They've got something else they're using for virtual. Maybe they're not even protecting their mobile devices. That's pretty common. But then they'll have maybe a third solution out there for endpoints. So it's a real mess on the source side. And there aren't many vendors who are focusing on building a platform that goes across all of them. What we strongly advise our clients to do is look for a vendor who has got an answer for you across these 4 buckets, or at least the subset of these buckets that matters to you. You might have made a decision as a business to ignore mobile endpoints. That's fine, that's the decision, but then try and find a vendor who can support the other 3 buckets, for example. One thing I'd love to hear from you about, Curtis, is what are you seeing on the target side, right? Like, our observation is that the target side was a lot simpler 15 years ago. It was just tape. It was just on-prem. It wasn't a great solution, but it was simpler. Whereas with the rise of disk and on-prem appliances, that actually added more complexity. Now with the rise of both clouds, public and private, and the advent of hybrid clouds, whereas once the target side was simple, from where I'm sitting, it seems to have gotten a lot more complex. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, well, again, the whole we don't fix it, we just move it problem, right? I mean, it's kept. Let's just say it's kept me in business as a backup expert for the last 15 years, right?
Right.
We've gotten a lot more really interesting and very advanced ways to back up, but those advanced ways are definitely more complex than the alternatives. But we had no choice because the source side got much more complex, right? You talk about 20 years ago, I was just explaining to somebody that 20 years ago, my big server was 6 gigabytes, right? So, that's now not even the smallest iPod, right? So
right.
complexity has happened on both sides of the thing, so.
Yeah, and so that's actually probably a good segue into this next trend, which is whilst we talk a lot about how the cloud has had a lot of promise for data protection with its its promises of unlimited capacity and resiliency, there have been barriers to adoption. And so the other day I really liked the way you talked about physics as one of the issues. So over to you.
Yeah, darn Einstein. So really the first problem as I see it with the cloud, right? Because I remember the first time I heard of backing up over the internet, right? I was like, what? Like, how in the world am I going to move that data? You look at just 1 terabyte of data with a T1 takes 1 month. That's assuming you have 100% capacity of that T1 and no one else is using it and you have no collisions and whatever, right? So it's just a matter of physics. And you look at the size of the typical data center, it's many terabytes. In fact, I just did I was in New York Tuesday, or not, sorry, I was in San Francisco, and we do a survey, an audience response system in our shows that I was surprised to see that there were, I think about 5% of the audience had a multi-petabyte data center, which is amazing, right? Dedupe, has helped, and so has WAN optimization, right? But that's but the real problem is simply one of physics, right? It's also, you talked about complexity. Complexity is that there are a bunch of different things that are in our way, right? And there are a bunch of different, backup is a relatively simple concept in concept, a relatively complex concept in execution, right? And the matter of troubleshooting and, hey, I push this button and nothing happens, right? You're having to deal with people that don't understand that, right? It's difficulty, and then pricing can also get pretty difficult. And then finally, I'd say the biggest barrier today, we haven't 100% solved the physics problem. We'll never completely remove physics from the equation, but there are a lot of good solutions to the physics problem for certain sizes of data centers. The security problem is really one of emotion. I think there are great solutions there as well, but people are, there's been so many hacks with things like Target and all of that stuff that people are fundamentally concerned about security, and in my opinion, they have an unfounded fear of cloud backup providers. It could just cloud providers in general. The reason why I say that is just because you have the data doesn't mean it's any more secure than if somebody else has the data. In fact, my experience has been, and I mean no offense to anyone on the call, but my experience has been that the typical security of the typical cloud provider is far in a far better place than the typical security I find at the typical, we'll call it, end user company. So this idea of I don't want it in the cloud because it's insecure, I don't see it as well. But it is absolutely the number one objection that I get when I talk about going to the cloud.
Yeah, and one of the things we're seeing is, so I really like that concept of physics and emotion, right, as the two big buckets of barriers to cloud adoption. And to me, complexity is actually an emotion because it's a fear of cloud, it's a fear of the unknown. So to me, the second two bubbles on this slide are actually still both points about emotion. But within the security and privacy debate, it's interesting now that there's so much more focus on the privacy component of it. I think some of the things like the Edward Snowden disclosures, the incident with Jennifer Lawrence recently, it's all shone a light on the fact that there are smart ways to put data in the cloud, and then there are ways that are not so smart to put data in the cloud. So, I'm here as a vendor, and I'm trying to advise people, what to look for in a backup vendor. One of the things you've got to look for in a backup vendor is what's called double-blind encryption, which it goes to the heart of what you're talking about, where the data in a cloud service data center like Infrascale, it should be safer than the data in your own data center. And it is if you use things like double-blind encryption, where the basic concept is similar to, say, a bank deposit box. You need your key to unlock the data, and you need the bank manager's key to unlock it. You've both got to be there present. So you've got a lot of cloud providers like, say, a Dropbox or a Box.com who just, to pick file sharing vendors, who just send raw data to their data center. That's depicted on the bottom half of this particular slide. They then encrypt that data at the data center and store it, but they keep the keys. And that's a relatively risky approach to security. What we do at Infrascale and what some other vendors do with double-blind encryption is actually to allow the user to control an encryption key. So in the top half of this slide, you can see some Office files there going into a little container, a little encryption box, if you will, which then gets sent over the internet and then encrypted again at the data center and stored inside those two encryption envelopes. And so this is something we really think customers must look for in a backup vendor. We're not the only ones who do it. It's an approach to security that's been around for a long time, but it's not used by some of the more popular cloud service providers. But I think it is becoming standard and will become standard. We've been talking about it at Infrascale for years, and now a lot of people are listening, right? Anything to share on that?
Well, just, I think that anybody that's storing data offsite that isn't encrypting it, if it's data that you care about at all, right? There's multiple issues. There's security of like hackers, and then there's security of like, three-letter acronym government entities that, if we say them on here, then, we'll get listened to. And the thing is that if you're not storing data, if you're storing data offsite and you're not encrypting it in some way, then you're just, I don't know what word to use. It doesn't sound insulting. And yeah, what I tell people, there are a number of different ways to do this. And what I tell people is that if you to ask your cloud provider, say, what happens if I lose my key? The only acceptable answer is, then you're screwed, right? Because if they can send you your data, if they can send you a new key and you can get your data back, that means they have your key, right? Or that means they can also do that on behalf of someone else, right? Such as the government, or they can do that, or someone else, someone nefarious could do that, who's a black hat who has hacked into them or whatever. So the only acceptable answer is, you are screwed if you lose your key. So don't do that.
Yeah, so it's awesome to hear you say that, right? Because that actually reverses the approach that a lot of people have been preaching. A lot of people want the expedience of the cloud service provider to be able to return the key. But you're absolutely right that is the only acceptable answer.
Yeah, it's convenient to not have a lock on my front door, right?
Yes.
It's convenient to I talk about security. I talk about it's convenient for me to give my key to every one of my neighbors, so that if I lose my key, I can get in my house. Well, guess what? So can all my my neighbors. Security and convenience has never been in the same car. Right.
Well, but see, that's an interesting thing, right? So we talk about how complexity kills businesses, right? Complexity doesn't just kill backup strategies; it kills businesses. Security doesn't have to be complex, right? We've built it into the product. It's a single step screen to generate your key and save it. It doesn't have to be complex. I think too many vendors are lazy and tell their customers that they have to choose between simplicity and elegance on the one hand and security on the other. CEO of Dropbox recently gave a speech where he talked about that. He said, look, we made a deliberate decision not to encrypt data so that it was easier for users. Well, we think that's crazy, right? You shouldn't trust anybody with your data. But you certainly shouldn't trust your cloud service provider to have ongoing access to your data. And you don't need to. You can do it in a way that's secure and safe, but still simple.
Yeah, and I agree. I guess, my point was that just historically, right, they don't, I remember doing backups and I was pushing for, this was 20 years ago and before I knew anything about security, and I was trying to do backups with RSH, right, and the security people were yelling at me that was insecure, and I'm like, I don't know, I got to do backups. I don't care about security. I want to, yeah. So I always saw security, back in the day, I always saw the security guys as the enemy because they were just trying to make my job harder, right?
Yeah.
But you're right. It doesn't have to make your job harder, but you can't say, well, that's, that makes me, like, just the whole, it's inconvenient if I lose my key and I don't have my data. Well, then, that's, but that's really the only acceptable answer.
Right. And that's actually a pretty good segue to sort of control of data and the rise of the hybrid cloud appliance, which combines the on-prem data which you control and the benefits of cloud. So, what are you? Well, this is our sort of a generation slide, which do you want to go ahead and sort of give us your perspective on this? Yeah,
and it's a little bit out of order. It's just sort of like artistic here, but I'd say we kind of started with the one on the right, D to D, right? So we started with backing up the data on site, and of course, before this we had tape, right? But the world of backups, the disk-based world of backup started with D to D, right? We backed up to disk, and then what most people did was they did D to D to T, right? So they backed up to a disk on site, and then they copied to to a tape and handed that to, as I say, a dude in a truck. You would probably say a bloke in a truck. And actually, that's still what most people are doing today. As I see it, just for cost reasons, they still back up to a disk on site and then hand that to a dude in a truck. And then when we got the advent of being able to back up to the cloud, we started seeing disk to cloud, right? So we got specifically when we started getting what I call source deduplication software, right? Which was one of the tools that allowed us to deduplicate the data at the source and say, have a conversation and say, talk to the cloud and say, I've got this chunk of data that looks like this. Have you seen it before? And the cloud would say, well, yeah, I've seen that before because I backed it up from the other guy's laptop, right? Or I backed it up from you last week, right? Even if you moved a file around, it would say, hey, yeah, I've seen that before. And then you could back up directly to the cloud, and that was awesome. And the only problem with that, I remember when I first started doing backups to the cloud, to a cloud provider that then got acquired by a large big box vendor that then changed the pricing and basically told me they didn't want me anymore via that pricing. And so I went to a different provider. But I remember the very first time I did that backup, it took me, I had at that time, I had about 300 or 400 gigabytes of data at home. It took me 3 months to get my first backup, right? That was the physics problem that we talked about, right? But then the real problem is when we go to do a restore, right? Getting that data back across the cloud, right? So if I've managed to get that first backup, it's going to take me 3 months to get that first backup. Well, guess what? It's going to take me 3 months to get it back too. So we started coming up with this idea of the disk to cloud, right? Which is now sort of a hybrid approach where we put the data that, the recent data on premise, right, in an appliance, and then we end up, we use we all know that 99% of the restores come from, I'd say 90% of them come from the last few days, and then the other 9% comes from the last 30 days, and then 1%, I mean, I'm certainly pulling numbers out of the air, but 1% of them are older than that. So let's look at that, right? Let's look at the restores that we typically do and say, okay, so we need to keep the last 2 weeks or 30 days of data and keep that on site, but then keep everything, back to whatever we deem as a recovery point. We keep that off site, and we keep that at a cloud provider, and of course we dedupe it and we encrypt it. We dedupe it for cost reasons because it also reduces the cloud bill, but and also for physics reasons, and then we encrypt it for security reasons. So we've got the stuff that we need for much quicker recoveries on site, and then we've got everything also stored off site, and that's the world of the hybrid appliance.
Yeah, and it's the best of both worlds. Look, I grew up on a cattle farm in Australia, and my dad would always say to me that if you use the right tool for the job, any job's easy, and that's really appropriate for the hybrid cloud appliance, because it gives you the right tools to manage your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective. Like that 3 months you talked about, it really hurts direct to cloud backup. But with a hybrid cloud appliance, you can keep your most critical data on site. You can keep your most sensitive data on site only, but then spill over or fail over to this magical cloud that always has capacity and is always online. So we think it's the future of data protection. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, physics dictates that, right? Certainly, the cloud is the future of data protection for a long list of reasons, but the cloud has physics problems by itself, right? So this helps address one of the physics problems, which is it's all about the recovery, right?
Right.
It is not, for the record, all about that base. That was a song joke, in case anybody. It's all about that recovery, and you can't pull several terabytes back across the internet without without changing the laws of physics. So yes, I think having a local appliance for local restorers and then using the cloud as a long term, yeah, I'd see that definitely as the future.
Yeah, and for the audience, I mean, like there's three things I'd say that when you're looking at appliances to keep in mind. The first big one is make sure the appliance lets you have less than your full data set on-prem. So on this diagram, on the left, we've got 11 terabytes of data, but the appliance has only got 2 terabytes. Many of the old school appliance vendors will actually force you to buy an 11 terabyte appliance, and that becomes expensive. That's the first thing. The second thing to look for is cloud agnosticism, or what I mean by that is the ability to use multiple clouds, whether that's the vendor's cloud, like the Infrascope cloud in our case, or Microsoft Azure or Amazon Web Services. That's really important. And then the third thing to look for is the integrated software. So again, on this diagram at the left, we're showing endpoints and workstations and file servers and app servers. There are some appliances out there where really they're just target appliances. You need to still go and buy a product like Backup Exec. There are far more modern solutions where it's fully integrated. It comes with cloud, it comes with the on-prem appliance, and it comes with the software you need for your physical servers, your virtual servers, your workstations, endpoints, and mobile devices. So those would be my top 3 tips there. Anything to add to that list of sort of criteria, Curtis?
No, I think you pretty much nailed it.
Okay, so we're coming up on time here. I know we're going to do some Q&A. I might just take sort of 1 minute here just to talk about Infrascale as a company. We've been around for quite some time. We're 150 employees worldwide, 1,000 distribution partners. What we focus on doing is total data protection. So pretty much all of the buying tips I gave in this presentation are things that we support, not surprisingly. But what we've built is a protection that really covers everything you need in terms of your source devices and your target devices. So this slide here really sums up our value prop. I call it the dartboard. That if you think about all of these nouns or device types, mobiles, desktop, laptops, and servers, and we break out servers into file, email, app, database, and then virtual, right? And if you think about all these verbs, all these use cases, simple backup, full-on disaster recovery, archiving, and file sharing, we support all of this. So you can throw a dart at this diagram, and wherever you land, Infrascale's got a solution for you. More than 100 different source-side operating systems supported, all the major flavors of Windows, Unix, Linux, as you'd expect on the server side, Windows with Mac on endpoints, and then on mobiles, iPhone, Android, and Windows Phone. And then very importantly at the bottom, we also give our customers a choice of cloud target. So we have our own cloud storage service, but you can also use Amazon, you can use Microsoft Azure and others. We support private clouds like OpenStack or VMware clusters. And then we sell appliances also, both standalone appliances as well as hybrid cloud appliances. But it all comes back to one key concept, which is taking the complexity out of data protection. And that means reducing your source side complexity and reducing target side complexity, giving you the confidence that no matter what the data protection challenge is, Infrascale is going to have a solution for you. And for us, that simplicity or that elimination of complexity is key because, as I said, complexity kills businesses. It also kills backup strategies. And so we're really trying to simplify that with a total data protection platform. And that's the end of the presentation. So thank you, Curtis, for your time. Hopefully you can stick around and we can answer some of the questions from the audience.
Absolutely.
Any questions, Curtis, you've got for me about this offering and our solution?
Let me think a minute. Why don't we take a...
We'll take an audience question. All right.
Yeah.
So let me pull up some questions here. So, all right. First question from Morris. Product question. Is MySQL pervasive SQL native backup on the horizon or available? MySQL is available right now. Pervasive SQL is on our roadmap, Morris. All right. Now, remember, everybody, we are giving away that Kindle Fire, so if you ask questions, you've got a greater chance of actually getting drawn for that. All right. So, question here from David. What about line of business apps, data that can't work on tablets, phones? David, maybe if you could ask that question with a bit more detail, I'd be able to answer that. Wade writes, how about corrupted files when moving to the cloud due to internet issues? So Wade, we use a variety of checksumming techniques to verify data integrity, to make sure that data that is being replicated is an accurate and recoverable copy of data on the source side. So we take care of that. Barbara writes a question that maybe, Curtis, you can answer. Is sending data over the internet considered secure?
Sending unencrypted data over the internet is no more secure than, painting the social security number, your social security number on your front of your house. But sending encrypted data is safe. I would say it's just as safe as sending an encrypted tape via a dude in a truck, right? So if it's encrypted, then you can do anything with it, right? Short answer is, if it's encrypted, yes.
Yep. And so Wade asks, when I say yep, I mean I agree with that wholeheartedly. Wade asks, what are your thoughts on disaster recovery across the cloud, or is that even an option? So Curtis, I'm not sure how much you're seeing as sort of disaster recovery as a service, but one of the things we support is the ability to spin up VMs in our data center environment for customers. Again, are trying to address that RTO and RPO consideration. And so, Wade, it certainly is possible. It's a new field, it's a growing field. It's one that we're working on and we already have solutions for. Curtis, are you seeing much in the DRaaS sort of space?
It's funny. I'd never heard it called a DRaaS. I've never heard it pronounced as an acronym before. But yeah, I'd say it's starting to become more common, right? What I'm seeing is there are starting to be companies that are able to spin up VMs of both VMs and physical machines, right, to do a P2V conversion during a disaster. And I really do think that is if the true future is either that or me being able to do that myself, right? This idea,
absolutely.
The old idea of having to do a restore to do a recovery, I think really, really needs to change. Again, the laws of physics and the laws of business have changed so that the business has come to expect what is the impossible via the old way, right? They're wanting RPOs of 0 and RTOs of spelled in minutes, not hours and days, right? So the only way to do that is to have the data already restored or never put into a backup container in the first place and stored in its native format, and then you just boot up the VM, whether you do that proactively or you do that on demand. Yeah, I'd see that's absolutely the way of the future, and I'm starting to see it in some of the providers.
Yeah, and so Wade, if you're interested in learning about what we've got, ask about our Cloud Boot offering. But yeah, I think I totally agree with Curtis. This is the true future of data protection, and the cloud really makes it possible, right? I think even 5 years ago, this was a very difficult technical problem to solve. Just speaking as an ex-programmer. The cloud's made this far more possible with elastic storage and elastic compute resources now available, that we can do things like the P2V conversion on the fly that Curtis was just talking about. And so, we've got some background noise there, but look for more and more companies offering DR as a service, and ask about InfraScale Cloud Boot. Lorne asks, is there a way to get a copy of this slideshow? Lorne, yes, there is. You'll get an email with this presentation within 24 hours.
Are you talking about getting the promotion email out?
David writes,
okay.
What is the recommended number of versions and most critical data files to have on the appliance?
Okay.
Well, Curtis, you made a comment about this, with keeping the most recent backup set on an appliance and then keeping your history in the cloud.
Well done.
Yeah, just curious, anybody else who isn't Ken or me, just mute your line if you would. There's something going on, background noise there. I actually forgot the question.
What's the recommendation between?
Yeah, retention. well, honestly, that I was a consultant for a long time, and the answer to every question is what? It depends, right? This is a business question, not a technology question, right? You have to look at the number of restores that you do, right? And that, I mean, I worked at a bank where we did 10 restores a day, right? Because we had 12,000 users who could call up at any time and request a restore. But my favorite was the one where the guy called up and asked me to restore resume.doc, and I said, resume.doc, you mean your resume, right? And so we did 10 to 12 restores a day, but I've worked at companies where they've kept track of all their restores and also sort of the recovery period, right? Most people do most of their restores from yesterday's files, right? And so, the only question is how much farther back than a couple of days do you need to go? It has a cost, has an associated cost because it's going to increase the size of the on-site appliance, but it has an increased value in terms of those older restores that you do are now going to be able to be done faster. So the question is, how often do you do that? How often do you go back more than a week, right, or a month, right? The easy answer is to say a month, and that's going to meet 99% of your restore needs probably, but maybe a week is fine, right? It depends on your company and how often you do restores.
And let me engage in a little shameless self-promotion here. With Infrascale, we don't charge for versions in the cloud. So what we do is we charge by the terabyte, say on the appliance, with unlimited versions. So you don't actually have to make the choice around the amount of versioning you want to keep in the cloud. You can have 10,000 versions of a file if you wanted to, and it can change every day. And we get customers who've been doing that for years and years. And then with our smart appliances, because it's seamlessly moving workloads between the on-prem box and the cloud, you don't really need to worry about capacity planning on that box. It'll just magically spill over, which is pretty cool. So I think that actually it ties into a few of the problems, Curtis, you just rattled off, in terms of both A, capacity planning, and B, cost. All right, so next question is, so we've got some more product-specific questions, but David asked, what type of capacity can your appliance handle? David, the individual boxes go from 2 terabytes to 150 terabytes on the large side and can be chained together to form up to a single petabyte appliance-based solution. So enormous variance from low side to high side there. Another question here from Charles, does your appliance integrate with Symantec Backup Exec 2014? Charles, why on earth would you want to use Symantec Backup Exec 2014? We don't integrate with them. We aim to replace them. So if you're a Backup Exec shop, we would actually try and displace Backup Exec. You could theoretically use our appliance in a Backup Exec environment, but that's not something we'd recommend. Morris writes, can I use a Linux server as a cache server virtual appliance? Absolutely, Morris. We ship our appliances as both physical appliances and virtual appliances. So you can run that in whatever hypervisor, within reason, all the major hypervisors. Dave writes, line of business apps. Curtis made it sound like all apps are now usable on tablets and phones. Curtis?
Did I?
I don't.
I don't think I think what I said is that so much more compute is happening at the edge. That's all I'm saying, right? I'm not saying any more than.
You said something interesting about data creation too.
Oh,
right?
well, yeah. Well, what I'm talking about is there are increasingly apps that are running on devices that are at the edge, whether it's tablets or mobile devices, that are creating data that is corporate data, right?
Yep.
It depends on your business line. It depends on all sorts of things, but whether it's I'll just give it one. Every company has a marketing department, right?
Right.
Marketing data, marketing collateral is not getting created on a server. it's getting created on somebody's laptop, right?
Yep.
And that's really important data that needs to be put at, at the edge. I do think about things like CRM stuff, but CRM, I mean, if you're not using Salesforce or something like Salesforce at this point, then you're really out there at this point, right?
Right.
So that data is not getting created. Well, it is getting created at the edge, but it's getting stored in the cloud, right? But there are other apps that run, I'd say that, the most used corporate app is Microsoft Word, and that stuff's getting created at the edge, right? And Excel, right? And it's getting created on a laptop, not getting created on a server, and at best, it's getting copied or synced to a server at some point, and that's really important stuff getting created. That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about.
Well, and there's this sort of inverse relationship between data importance sometimes and its protection. Like, CEOs are generally producing a lot of their content on a laptop, and that laptop is very often outside the data protection regime, which is crazy. Your average sales team, same thing, happens. And another thing to think about is also the sort of data protection as a term. We're starting to push more and more into that, so that for us, data protection sometimes means doing a remote wipe or being able to find that device. So with Episcale, you can nuke a laptop and format it remotely if you need to. I think that's a growing trend also.
Yeah, and there are some apps on tablets that, even to the point of tablets, there are some apps on tablets. The thing is that tablets, iPads and the like, were designed as media consumption devices, not media creation devices. But there are absolutely some apps that have been created for those devices that create data on those devices, and then not only is that data not getting synced to the cloud in some cases, it's in a special container in that iPad.
That's right.
That only that app can get to, which as a data protection guy drives me batty, right?
Yep.
That there is no super user for me to back that data up, right? And the problem is those apps do exist and are creating data, and at best we hope that person is syncing that iPad to a laptop, which we can then back up, but probably they're not doing that either. They're creating some data and
And you've now picked up on a problem in the industry that we haven't solved. So the container problem on iOS we have not solved.
Yeah, well, that's like trying to solve physics. It's a fundamental design flaw it was designed for security. This is another one where they designed this for security, but from a system management and data protection standpoint, it's a real PITA. The only for corporate data, the solution from mine is the MDM space, right? That allows me to run corporate apps in a container on my iPad, and that data is synced back to the corporate. That's for the true mobile devices, right? The tablets and stuff. That's the only thing I think from a corporate thing that makes any sense, at least for me.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think your point about laptops is totally key, and laptops are often left outside of the data protection regime. They don't have to be.
Yep.
The benefit of the cloud is it connects to everything. So, again, self-serving recommendation, I know, but you've got to pick a vendor who can handle your servers and handle your laptops. Mobile devices is more of a silver lining. There are not many vendors who can handle all of them. We can, for a few others. But endpoint is a must these days. Product like Backup Exec 2014, we just talked about it. It's got, in my opinion, rubbish support for endpoints. In this day and age, that's just not acceptable anymore. Well, we've got a bunch more questions online. Curtis, do you have time to stick on, or?
I'm hanging out.
All right. Robert asks, what sort of dedupe do you use, fixed window or sliding window? Robert, great question. We use the source side full object dedupe that Curtis was talking about earlier, and we also use sliding window deduplication as well when we're doing incrementals and actually detecting the binary differential and binary incremental slice of data to send over the WAN. Question here from Sumya. This is Shuomo from Edmonton, Canada. The question from your 11 terabyte data slide example, are you telling me backup immediate required data 2 terabytes and then send 9 terabytes to the cloud. Here's what we're recommending with hybrid cloud appliances, and I think Curtis talked about this as well. Keep the most important data on-premise, and there are a variety of algorithms you can use to determine the most important data. Curtis was talking about recency. So if it was recently backed up, then that can be deemed more important. There are other things you can do. For example, you can profile the data type. If this is Exchange data or SQL data, you might want to keep it on-prem. But you keep the data on-prem that you need a really fast recovery time objective for or recovery point objective for, both. And then you replicate out to the cloud everything else. And this does become a cost decision. You really need to make a decision about how much you're willing to spend to keep data on fast disk on-prem that allows you to bring it back within minutes. Jose asks, do you offer failover to the cloud in the case of a total system failure? Jose, we do. We call that our Cloud Boot service. Barbara writes, can we use InfraScale as a target for net backup? Barbara, same answer as my backup exec question. You can, but we would actually suggest that you consider replacing that backup, or at least the new infrastructure you're deploying, use InfraScale software. InfraScale solution is an integrated solution that works best when you use it all together, a little bit like the iPhone, works better with your Mac. But we can work alongside net backup if you're not interested in rip and replace. Okay. Barbara also writes, does InfraScale offer different buckets to use for different types of data, i.e. backup file servers? Barbara, we do. So when I support multiple targets, you might use an on-prem appliance for really sensitive data, right, that you don't want to go off-site to the cloud. And then a very popular trend, and maybe Curtis has got an opinion on this, is people finally getting rid of their tape archives. So we often get calls, I'm sure Curtis does too, somebody's got 600 terabytes sitting on tape, and somebody's made a business decision to get that off the tape. Cloud's a great use for that. Curtis, do you ever come across that in your practice?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd say I'd say for every person that I have that said they were going to move off tape, I probably have another one who tried and wasn't able to for cost reasons. But I mean, it costs a lot more than they think it does, right? And I don't put tape in the evil category. I think tape's a great device for the right purpose. What that right purpose isn't is the initial target for backups. I haven't recommended tape as the initial target for backups for over 10 years. It's been disk for that long. It's a cheap target as the secondary target, for to do the dude in the truck. It's still cheaper than the replication option, but at least every time I compare it, it comes out cheaper. But the disk to disk to disk, the hybrid appliance, whether it's the hybrid appliance approach or if you own all of the gear, that is sort of backup nirvana, if I can use that phrase, having backups on site and backups off site, and no dude in a truck, right? As long as Iron Mountain and companies like them use human beings. When we all go to Google cars and robots, maybe I'll change my my answer. But bandwidth, trucks have great bandwidth. They have lousy latency, right?
Yeah.
In backups, latency matters a lot, right? Recoveries latency is king, right? So if you're using tape, and you're doing the typical tape rotation, your backup, when it's Monday morning and you have a disaster, the latest backup you have is the one that was made Thursday night, because your Friday tapes don't get sent off until Monday, right? So you're going to lose at least 2, maybe 3 days worth of data, and that's assuming that you didn't, one of your backups didn't fail, right? And I believe in Murphy's Law of backups, which is the backup that failed is probably going to be the one that you need to restore the next day, right?
Yep.
That's been my experience.
And it's interesting. I mean, so you talked about the cost. We would actually argue that a disk-to-disk to cloud solution can now achieve price parity with disk-to-disk to tape. Like certainly ours does. So when we do one-to-one price comparisons, The other thing is you can start a lot cheaper, right? To get a sophisticated tape system can be expensive, but the human element to operate is key, and the mistakes that can be made. For smaller businesses that don't have large internal IT forces, that those additional costs, those hidden costs are pretty important to evaluate.
Yeah, I think I would actually agree with you there. I guess maybe I'm talking about maybe a much bigger environment where automation is assumed, and and you can buy those giant tape libraries, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say for them, what we argue is that the small business and the mid-market enterprise, like up to about 1,000 employees, Distributed to cloud should now be their primary. That should be the starting point when they're designing data protection. And if for a variety of reasons they have to eliminate it, fair enough. But that should be the starting point, particularly as we're designing for the future, right? Bandwidth is just coming down, the cost of cloud storage is just coming down, and that hybrid cloud architecture really is the place to start in your data protection design. All right, so a few more questions here, and then we'll have to wrap it up. But Lewis asks, he's in Mexico, can I sell your solutions here? Absolutely, Lewis. Sumya writes, if a customer loses the key, then what is the alternative? Well, Sumya, as Curtis said, the customer is out of luck in that scenario, and that is the security, the secure approach. What we always recommend is that customers have an on-prem appliance in the cloud data, and then they would be able to recover from their on-prem appliance if they lost their encryption key.
Yeah, and I just have to concur there that any cloud vendor that gives you an answer different than that is not a cloud vendor you should be using. End of story.
Right. Yep, totally agree. Lewis writes, so if you support unlimited versions, can I restore a file that I deleted 6 years ago? If you were a customer of ours from 6 years ago, Lewis, you absolutely could. So yeah, we've got some customers that, so Infrascale owns the assets of a company called SOS Online Backup, which I was the CEO of. That business dates back to 2001. So we have Infrascale customers who have 10 years of data in our cloud that they can recover, which is quite powerful. David writes, does your appliance require backup software like NetBackup? Would we get rid of that backup software? David, that's the beauty of it. It's fully integrated. You get all the software you need. So we support Linux, Unix, Windows. We support VMware at the hypervisor level. We support, when it comes to laptops, Windows and OS X. So it's a fully integrated appliance with the software, the hardware, the cloud storage, and the management layer, right? And that management layer is critical. Managing a heterogeneous data protection environment is a real bear. Having a single pane of glass that aggregates all that information up to you in a single page view is critical. And as devices proliferate and data fragments, that's going to become more and more important. If you're so inclined, have a look at our dashboard, which not only shows you all the software you get access to, but aggregates all that up to you into one pane of glass for up to 50,000 endpoints. Morris writes, can we trust app-specific cloud services, i.e. Salesforce, etc., to do our app-specific backups? Will Infrascale provide cloud app-type backup as part of the Infrascale ecosystem? So, Morris, if you're asking about cloud to cloud, like backing up Salesforce or Infrascale, we're not there yet. It is on our roadmap for 2015, though. Morris also writes, I'd like to be able to specify backups via enterprise Wi-Fi connections for laptops and not home Wi-Fi, where home is metered. Okay, Morris, we've got, so as part of when Curtis talked about physics as a barrier to cloud backup, we talked about two things there, right? One was bandwidth as a solution, but the other is what I call data payload reduction, or in other words, managing and shrinking the bits and bytes we're actually going to send over the WAN. Within data payload reduction, you got three things. You got compression, you got dedupe, and you got WAN optimization. A big part of WAN optimization isn't just, say, TCP/IP optimization, but it's also then traffic shaping and traffic management. So we do support the type of pattern you're talking about. We would do it through time scheduling, and we'd make sure that that laptop's not going to it's only going to run its backups over the WAN at the right times. And there's a variety of algorithms for that. Okay, a bunch more questions on the line, which is great. For historical tape backups, can you read tape for backup exec, etc., into the cloud or hybrid cloud on Infrascale? Yeah, Morris, we would help you with the solution for that. that wouldn't be an out-of-the-box thing. That'd be something one of our sales engineers would help you with. But yes, we do support that. We do that quite a bit. Barbara writes, what is the most expensive part of backing up to the cloud? Curtis said that tape as a second copy is still cheaper than backup to the cloud. What makes cloud backup more expensive? So Barbara, I think just to reiterate the back and forth between Curtis and I, my belief, and I won't speak for Curtis, but my belief is that in small environments up to about 1,000 employees, disk-to-disk cloud can in fact be cheaper. And that's when you layer in the cost of consultants, the cost of downtime, the cost of labor. So if you look at it through TCO, total cost of ownership, disk-to-disk cloud is great. For larger enterprises, the disk-to-disk tape will often be cheaper. Curtis, where do you think the cutoff might be?
Yeah, I don't do employees. I do like gigabytes or terabytes or whatever. I'm not sure where the cutoff. It's more about the cutoff of. I don't know. I haven't. I'd say definitely it's when data gets really big, right?
Yep.
And how big is really big? Well, it matters. What matters is like your change rate, right? If you're doing the hybrid approach, what matters is your change rate more than the amount of data you have. You could have a petabyte, 10 petabytes stored in the cloud, as long as you don't change it very much, right? And you have an on-premise 10 petabyte, appliance, right, to restore that data. But it's about the change rate, right? And it's more in terms of cost. I don't know where the crossover is. I think where when you start getting enough data where you can start buying the big tape libraries, right? So the tape libraries that I'm talking about, I mean, literally, it costs more to fill them up with tape than it does to buy the tape library sometimes, right?
Right.
When you start getting to that level of capacity, tape still, at some point, tape becomes cheaper than disk, right? Do I use tape? Do I use tape for as much as I like tape for long-term storage? I don't use it myself for day-to-day. I use it only for archival purposes, right? And I use LTFS, right? We do video production as part of our company, and I take all of the source video, which can be huge, and I move it off to an LTFS tape so that I can hold that for a long period of time. I find that cheaper than buying and running a mini terabyte disk array, But yeah, it's an it depends answer, right? Run the numbers yourself, right? And I'm sure an InfraScale sales rep would be more than happy to run those numbers for them.
Yes, indeed. And in terms of future-proofing, yes, obviously I'm biased. I would buy cloud because if I'm worried about future-proofing, right? Because the cost of storage in the cloud is just coming down and down and down and down, and if you look at the cost reduction curve of cloud storage over the last 5 years, and the same for tape, cloud is outperforming it in terms of the decay rate of price, and I think that trend's actually going to accelerate. So as part of your it depends analysis is you've got to sort of think about what's going to happen in the space over the next few years. That's my 2 cents worth anyway. Wade writes, your backups are as good as your software used to back it up. Any suggestions there or solutions? Also need HIPAA compliance for medical customers. So Wade, so InfraScale ships software as part of the solution. We obviously think it's pretty great. We are HIPAA compliant, and we have a lot of partners of ours who focus just on the medical industry. HIPAA compliant backup is a very profitable, very hot subset of the data protection game. But I totally agree with you. I mean, when you're looking at an integrated backup appliance, the software that is king. We're a software company. To us, having an appliance is just a packaging option. Barbara writes, what type of internet connection does one need to send 120 terabytes of data as a backup image to a cloud provider? Barbara, to Curtis's commentary, it really depends. How fast you want to get it up there and how fast you want to bring it back. We see a lot of customers these days on Theos connections or their equivalent, very large pipes at very inexpensive price points. And that dynamic has changed a lot in the last few years. 4 more questions and then we'll be done. Wade writes, how often does appliance failure occur? What happens then? So Wade, appliance failure happens rarely. When it happens, it's usually user error, to be frank, but it does happen. And what happens there is we send out a new empty appliance. You log into your cloud portal, you pick that new empty appliance, and you pick the old appliance that you had, you press a button, and now magically all your data is on that local appliance. So it's an incredibly simple operation. In fact, with our solution, you can set up a disk-to-disk to cloud environment in under an hour, right? And I think that's powerful.
Hey, Ken, I've got a hard stop. I got to go. But
okay,
thanks, everybody, from me, and I'll let you finish up the rest of the questions. All right?
Thanks for your time, Curtis. This was great.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. David writes, I'm sorry, that's part of a, are you FedRAMP compliant? David, that's a great question. I'm not sure the answer to that. So we'll have to follow up with your email on that. Lewis writes, thanks for the invitation. Great. Thanks, Lewis, for coming. And then Jose writes, is there any value in offline backups compared to off-site backups? Jose, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that. If you're talking about sort of the difference between offline and online backups with apps, the world sort of changed a little bit. These days we'll do running snapshots of running apps. So we won't generally take an application, like an Oracle database, we used to take that offline to take a snapshot. We generally don't do that anymore, so that's sort of changed. That's the end of the questions, and it's good because we're out of time. So thank you, everybody, for your time today. It was wonderful to have Mr. Backup here on the line. If you've got any questions or you're interested in learning more about InfoScale Solutions, I'd really encourage you to call in and talk to one of our data protection specialists or one of our partner specialists. Phone numbers are on the screen, and we'll be figuring out who won the Kindle. It'll just be a random draw based on the questions that were asked, and we'll be emailing that out